In the midst of a war-torn Europe, the town of Verdun, nestled in the heart of France, had become a place where every day was a struggle for survival. The year was 1943, and the Second World War had already left its indelible mark on every corner of the continent. For the citizens of Verdun, life had become a balancing act, an intricate dance of fear, suspicion, and endurance. Under the iron grip of the German occupation, the once peaceful town had been transformed into a place where every movement was watched, every gesture scrutinized. The laughter of children in the streets had long been replaced by the heavy boots of soldiers, whose presence made every moment feel fraught with tension. For Marianne, the town's young schoolteacher, this new reality was both a painful loss and a haunting reminder of everything that had been taken from her. Marianne was a woman of 32, though she often felt much older. Her once bright eyes now carried the weight of years of hardship, a burden she had never imagined bearing. She had always been a teacher, a mentor to the children of Verdun, instilling in them not only knowledge but a sense of hope for a future that seemed far away, especially now. In those early days of the occupation, Marianne had clung to her job as though it were a lifeline. The school was one of the few remaining places where she could feel some semblance of normalcy, where the mundane rhythms of teaching, grading, and caring for her students provided a small buffer against the chaos that had engulfed her world. But those days of relative calm were quickly slipping away. As the Germans tightened their hold on France, the Gestapo began to infiltrate every aspect of daily life. The once cohesive fabric of society had begun to tear apart, as neighbor turned against neighbor, and even the simplest interactions carried the risk of betrayal. Marianne had witnessed the subtle erosion of trust, watching as friends and colleagues, once kindred spirits, were now forced to turn a blind eye to each other's actions or, worse, actively denounce one another. The war had planted seeds of fear and suspicion in even the most innocent of hearts, making it impossible to know who could be trusted. The world she had known was unraveling, and Marianne, though strong, felt herself being pulled along with it, helpless and unsure. The occupation brought with it not only fear but also a new, oppressive silence. The once bustling streets of Verdun now felt eerily quiet, punctuated only by the occasional sound of military trucks rumbling down the cobbled roads, their tires crushing the remains of a town that had once been full of life. The once joyful chatter of the townspeople had given way to hurried whispers behind closed doors, as people learned to be careful of what they said, where they said it, and to whom. Marianne herself had learned this lesson the hard way. She had long ago stopped discussing her true feelings with anyone. The wrong word, the wrong glance, could lead to suspicion, and in times like these, suspicion could be a death sentence. As the months passed, Marianne became increasingly aware of the risk she was taking by continuing to work as a teacher. It wasn't just the presence of the Germans that made it dangerous, it was the presence of the collaborators, those who had allied themselves with the occupying forces in exchange for power, food, or simply survival. These individuals were often the ones who would report any suspicious activity to the authorities, whether it was a whispered conversation, an unapproved gathering, or even the slightest hint of resistance. Marianne had seen them in the streets, their eyes constantly darting around, looking for signs of rebellion. She had overheard their hushed conversations, their assurances that they were only doing what needed to be done to protect their families. But Marianne knew better. She knew that, in the end, they were as dangerous as the soldiers themselves. One cold morning, as Marianne walked to school through the narrow, mist-covered streets, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The air was thick with tension, and the sense of impending danger seemed to hang over the town like a dark cloud. The town square, usually alive with the sounds of market vendors and children playing, was now silent, save for the heavy tread of boots. The soldiers had been increasing their patrols, and the presence of German officers had become a constant reminder of the power they held over the town. Marianne's heart sank as she passed a group of soldiers who were speaking with a local woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and Marianne quickly averted her gaze, not wanting to make eye contact with either the soldiers or the woman, who was likely being interrogated for some perceived transgression. The fear in the woman's eyes was enough to make Marianne's heart race, and she hurried her steps toward the school, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere outside. The school was not much of a refuge, though. The children's faces, once full of curiosity and enthusiasm, had become increasingly solemn. Many of them had already lost parents, siblings, or friends to the war, and their once bright eyes now mirrored the anxiety and fear that plagued their teachers. Marianne did her best to maintain some semblance of normalcy in her classroom, but it was becoming more and more difficult. The curriculum had been altered to reflect the new reality of life under occupation. History lessons were rewritten to glorify the German occupation, and any mention of resistance or Allied forces was banned. Marianne had always prided herself on teaching her students to think critically, to question what they were told, but now, in the face of an authoritarian regime, that kind of education was not only dangerous but impossible. She found herself wondering if her students would ever know the world she had once dreamed of for them, a world where freedom of thought and speech were respected, where hope had a place. Despite the constant surveillance and restrictions, there were moments when Marianne could feel a flicker of rebellion stir within her. She began to meet in secret with other teachers and resistance members, exchanging information and planning small acts of defiance. There were risks, of course, terrible risks, but Marianne knew that doing nothing was not an option. The thought of living under the yoke of oppression for the rest of her life was unbearable. And so, despite the dangers, she found herself becoming more involved in the resistance, though she was careful to remain in the shadows, never fully revealing herself to any one group. Each night, as she lay in her bed, listening to the distant sounds of military trucks and the occasional cry of a prisoner being taken away, she would wonder whether she was making a difference, whether her small acts of defiance could ever add up to something greater. But the truth was that Marianne had become a prisoner in her own home, in her own town. The fear of discovery, of being caught in the act of resistance, was a constant presence, gnawing at her every moment. It was a fear that she had learned to live with, but that did not make it any less real. And so, as she walked through the streets of Verdun, her heart pounding with every step, she wondered if she would ever be free again. Would she ever see the day when the town was liberated? Or would she, like so many others, become a casualty of a war that seemed never-ending, a casualty of a conflict she never asked for, but that had come to define her life? Every morning, she awoke with dread. It was a dread that no amount of hope or prayer could ease, for the shadows of war had settled too deeply in her soul. The laughter of children, the warmth of community, the simple pleasures of a life that once felt so secure, all of these things now seemed like distant memories. And in their place was only the cold, harsh reality of survival. The days stretched out before Marianne like a vast, unyielding sea, each one indistinguishable from the next, each one darker than the last. The slow, creeping terror of living under occupation had become a constant companion, a weight that pressed down on her chest and stole her breath away with every passing moment. The small town of Verdun, once a place of warmth and connection, had now become a place of ghosts, inhabited by the memories of better times, but also by the ever-present fear of the present and the unspoken dread of what might come. For Marianne, every footstep on the cobbled streets, every murmur behind a closed door, seemed to carry the possibility of betrayal. She knew that survival in this new world was not just about avoiding the obvious dangers. It was about navigating a labyrinth of suspicion and mistrust, where even the smallest misstep could lead to her undoing. As the days turned to weeks, Marianne's world grew smaller and smaller. The once familiar routine of teaching at the school had become an act of quiet rebellion. She still had her students, a small group of children whose faces now seemed etched with sorrow and war-weariness. The joy that once filled her classroom had been replaced by a hollow silence, broken only by the occasional nervous cough or the rustle of paper as the children tried to follow her instructions. She could feel the weight of their uncertainty, the growing awareness that their world was not what it had once been. Some of them had already lost family members to the war, and their innocence had been stripped away long before their time. Marianne did her best to comfort them, to offer some small semblance of normalcy in a world that had become anything but it was becoming harder to hold onto the pretense of normality. The very nature of teaching, of guiding young minds, was now tainted by the constant threat of the outside world intruding. The lessons she gave no longer seemed to matter. There was no escape from the pervasive atmosphere of dread that seemed to suffuse everything. The school had become a place of quiet surveillance. The German soldiers, who once patrolled the streets with a casual air of superiority, now kept a much closer watch on the townspeople. Their eyes were everywhere, and their presence was a constant reminder of how little control Marianne had over her own life. As the days passed, she found herself becoming more and more isolated, not just from her students, but from everyone around her. The once tight-knit community of Verdun had splintered, torn apart by fear, suspicion, and the unforgiving reality of war. Even the act of stepping out into the street had become a calculated risk. The slightest glance, the wrong word, could lead to disaster. Marianne had learned to keep her head down, to walk quickly and with purpose, to avoid making eye contact with the soldiers who now patrolled the town. The tension in the air was palpable, and Marianne had learned to live in a state of constant vigilance, always watching, always listening, but never truly connecting with anyone. In the evenings, when the school was closed and the streets were quiet, Marianne would return to her small apartment, a space that had once been a sanctuary, but was now a prison in its own right. The four walls seemed to close in around her, and the silence was suffocating. She longed for the days when the sounds of children playing in the streets had filled the air, when the laughter of her colleagues could be heard drifting from nearby cafes, when her own voice had been able to speak freely without fear of retribution. Now, her apartment felt like a tomb, a place where time stood still, and every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. The fear of discovery haunted her every waking moment. She had begun to avoid leaving her apartment at night, not only because of the curfew, but because the streets seemed more dangerous after dark. The shadows of the night were full of uncertainty, and Marianne had learned the hard way that it was better to stay hidden than risk encountering the wrong person at the wrong time. It was during these long, lonely nights that Marianne began to question everything she had known about the world, about herself. The war had taken so much from her, but perhaps more than anything, it had taken away her sense of certainty. She had always believed that she could make a difference, that by teaching her students the values of truth, kindness, and hope, she could shape the future. But now, as the war raged on, she began to wonder if such ideals had any place in a world that seemed to be spiraling out of control. Could she still make a difference in a town that had been so irrevocably changed? Could she still believe in the goodness of humanity when so many people had turned their backs on each other in the name of survival? The moral clarity she had once held so dear had begun to erode, replaced by a gray, indistinct fog that obscured everything in her life. Despite these doubts, Marianne continued to resist in small ways. She had heard whispers of the French resistance, of groups that were fighting back against the Germans in whatever way they could. The stories she heard were filled with acts of courage and defiance, bombings, sabotage, and daring rescues, but they also came with a price. The risks of getting involved were enormous, and Marianne knew that any mistake could cost her life. But there was a part of her that could no longer sit idly by, that could no longer live in fear. The resistance, however small, was a flicker of hope in an otherwise dark world, and it was the only thing that seemed worth fighting for. It started with small acts of defiance, passing along messages for the underground, offering what little food and resources she could spare to the resistance fighters who occasionally passed through town. She began to attend secret meetings, speaking in hushed voices with others who shared her convictions, though the fear of discovery always loomed over these gatherings. They were few and far between, but in those moments, Marianne felt something she hadn't felt in months: purpose. She began to understand that the war wasn't just something happening to the world around her, it was happening within her as well. She couldn't change the world by remaining silent. She couldn't save anyone if she wasn't willing to risk something herself. The fear, while ever present, became a source of strength. It pushed her to act, to fight back, even in small ways. But the fear was always there, always lurking just beneath the surface. Every time she passed a German soldier on the street, every time she looked into the eyes of a neighbor who might be a collaborator, every time she met someone in secret, Marianne knew that the risk of being caught was never far behind. It became impossible to shake the feeling that at any moment, she could be exposed, that the truth of her actions, no matter how small, would be revealed. And when that happened, the consequences would be devastating. Her involvement with the resistance was not just a matter of her own survival, It would also put the lives of her family, her friends, and anyone she came into contact with in grave danger. There were moments, late at night, when Marianne would lie awake, her thoughts racing, her heart pounding in her chest. In those moments, she would wonder if it was worth it, whether the price of resistance was too high. Could she live with the knowledge that her actions, even if they were small, might lead to the suffering or death of those she loved? Could she reconcile the risk she was taking with the hope that somehow, in some way, it would make a difference? The answers were elusive, and the questions only grew more complex as the war dragged on. In the midst of all this turmoil, there was one thing that remained certain. Marianne could not live in fear forever. She could not allow herself to become paralyzed by the possibility of discovery. She would fight in whatever way she could, and she would continue to teach her students, to offer them whatever fragments of hope she could find in a world that seemed to be disintegrating before her eyes. And so, with each passing day, Marianne held on to the fragile threads of defiance that remained within her, even as the weight of the occupation bore down harder and harder on the town of Verdun and its people. She was not yet ready to surrender. The world felt as though it was closing in on Marianne with each passing day, as if the walls of Verdun itself were drawing tighter around her. The once peaceful town, which had long been a quiet corner of France, had become a place of constant danger. The brutality of the occupation was no longer an abstract fear. It had become something intimate, something personal. The soldiers patrolling the streets were not faceless strangers anymore. They had become a familiar presence, their eyes sharp, their movements calculated, always watching. Even the townspeople who had once been her neighbors had become distant, wary figures, their faces often hidden behind masks of indifference or fear. The smallest act of defiance, the slightest misstep, could turn a person from a friend to an enemy in an instant. The town of Verdun, once full of life and chatter, had now become a silent place, ruled by suspicion and the constant threat of violence. Marianne could feel it in her bones every time she stepped outside. This was no longer her home. This was a place where survival was the only thing that mattered. The tension was suffocating, and yet, in the midst of it all, Marianne continued her work at the school. She taught as best she could, trying to provide the children with a sense of normalcy in a world that had lost its anchor. The classroom, once a place of joy and curiosity, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where, for a few fleeting hours, she could forget about the horrors outside. But even here, in this small corner of safety, there was danger. The children had changed. Their innocent laughter had been replaced by an unease that hung in the air. Some were withdrawn, their eyes dull with grief. Others had become far too aware of the world around them, their faces prematurely aged by the violence they had witnessed. Marianne did her best to shield them, to offer them a semblance of hope, but she knew that the world they were growing up in was no longer one where innocence could survive unscathed. But it wasn't just the children who had changed. Marianne herself was different now. She had always prided herself on being a strong woman, someone who could handle any challenge with grace and determination. But the constant pressure of living under occupation had begun to wear her down. Each day was a struggle to maintain composure, to keep up the appearance of calm in front of her students, her colleagues, her fellow townspeople. But inside, she was shaking. There was a gnawing anxiety that never let up, a fear that, no matter how much she tried to outrun it, would always be there, lurking in the background. She had learned to live with it, but it was a hollow existence, one where every breath felt heavy, every movement measured. Then, one evening as Marianne was returning from school, her worst fears were realized. She had been walking through the narrow streets of Verdun when she saw them, 2 German soldiers standing in the alleyway just ahead. They were talking quietly, their heads bent together in what appeared to be an unguarded moment. Marianne froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She had passed these soldiers countless times before, but tonight was different. The air felt thick with danger, and she knew, deep down, that something was not right. She had no reason to believe that they were watching her specifically, but the sense of dread that filled her senses told her otherwise. Her first instinct was to turn around, to retreat back to the relative safety of her apartment, but something held her in place. The soldiers were now looking in her direction, their gazes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. She tried to move casually, to walk as if she were just another face in the crowd, but the soldier's eyes seemed to follow her every step. Her stomach churned with a mixture of fear and helplessness. She had no escape, no way to hide. It was as if the world had suddenly turned against her, and she was the only one who could see it. She didn't know if they were simply curious or if they had already suspected something. It didn't matter. In that moment, Marianne knew that whatever happened next could change everything. Her mind raced as she calculated the best course of action. Should she continue walking, act as though nothing was wrong? Or should she make a run for it, risking the possibility of a confrontation? The soldiers began to move toward her, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Marianne's breath caught in her throat, her entire body trembling with fear. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. The soldiers stopped just in front of her, blocking her path. She could feel their eyes on her, their scrutiny piercing through her. For a long moment, no one spoke. The world seemed to pause as if holding its breath. Marianne's mind raced, searching for some way to defuse the situation, some way to make them leave her in peace. But the words wouldn't come. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Finally, one of the soldiers spoke, his voice low and rough. "Where are you going?" he asked, his gaze never leaving her face. His words were simple, but the weight behind them was anything but. There was no kindness in his tone, no recognition of her humanity. It was a question that felt like an accusation, a demand for compliance. Marianne's mind went blank. She didn't know what to say, how to explain herself. Her heart raced in her chest as the seconds stretched out, feeling like hours. I'm on my way home," she managed to say, her voice shaky, barely a whisper. She tried to keep her tone steady, to sound casual, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. She could feel the soldier's eyes boring into her, weighing her every movement, every word. The silence between them grew heavy, and she could feel her breath becoming more shallow with each passing moment. The soldier took a step closer, and Marianne instinctively took a step back. Her heart was pounding in her ears now, the blood rushing through her veins. She could feel the cold press of fear closing in, suffocating her. "You shouldn't be out here at this hour," he said, his voice colder now. "It's dangerous." The words hung in the air like a threat, a warning of the punishment that could come for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Marianne's mind raced, searching for something, anything, to say, but she couldn't find the words. The soldier's gaze was unwavering, and for a moment, Marianne thought he could see straight through her. He could see the secrets she had hidden, the things she had done in the shadows. He could see the resistance, the messages she had passed along, the quiet acts of defiance she had carried out in the name of something greater than herself. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the walls of her life had come crashing down around her. But then, just as quickly as the moment had arrived, it was over. The soldier nodded curtly, as if satisfied with whatever unspoken judgment had passed between them. Without another word, he stepped aside, allowing her to pass. The other soldier gave her one last glance before following his companion down the alleyway. Marianne stood there for a moment, unable to move, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the encounter. She felt as though she had narrowly escaped something much worse, something she couldn't even bring herself to imagine. But at the same time, she knew that the danger wasn't over. The soldier's words echoed in her mind, "It's dangerous," and she realized that the true danger was not just the soldiers themselves, but the creeping sense of paranoia and distrust that had taken root in her life. She wasn't just afraid of being caught. She was afraid of what it meant to live in a world where no one could be trusted, where every interaction was fraught with the possibility of betrayal. The soldiers, the collaborators, the neighbors, everyone had become a potential enemy, a potential threat. The feeling of dread lingered with her long after she had returned to her apartment. Her heart still raced, her mind still reeling from the encounter. But there was no time to rest. The war, with all its cruelty and destruction, was still raging, and she had to find a way to keep fighting, to survive in a world that had become unrecognizable. The encounter had left her shaken, but it had also reinforced something else, something deeper, something more profound. She couldn't afford to let fear control her. She couldn't afford to let the soldiers win. If she did, then everything she had done so far would have been for nothing. And so, despite the terror that gripped her, Marianne knew one thing for sure: she would continue to resist, even if it meant risking everything. Even if it meant that one day, the soldiers might come for her. The days that followed Marianne's terrifying encounter with the German soldiers were marked by a deep, unsettling sense of uncertainty. The weight of what had happened lingered in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be put out. She had narrowly escaped being discovered, yet the tension she felt was palpable. The very streets she once walked with a sense of purpose now seemed treacherous, as though every corner might hold the potential for disaster. The soldiers, though they had let her pass without incident, were still there, always present, always watching. Their eyes seemed to follow her wherever she went, and she found herself constantly on edge, never able to shake the feeling that she was being scrutinized, judged, and weighed by forces beyond her control. In the quiet moments, when she was alone in her apartment or walking through the desolate streets, Marianne couldn't help but question everything she thought she knew about the world. The occupation had stripped away the fabric of normalcy, leaving behind a shell of the life she once knew. Her students, the very children she had once taught with such optimism and hope, now seemed like ghosts. Their faces were drawn, their eyes clouded with confusion and fear. They no longer smiled the way they used to, no longer laughed with the careless abandon that had once filled the halls of her school. Even the classroom, once a place of growth and learning, had become a place of quiet compliance, where Marianne could only go through the motions, knowing that the true lessons were not the ones written in the books but the ones that came from the oppressive weight of the occupation itself. But despite the deep, pervasive dread that gripped her, there was something else stirring within Marianne, something that had been there all along but was now beginning to rise to the surface. It was a flicker of something she had long buried: hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there, urging her to continue, to push against the tide of fear that threatened to pull her under. It was the same hope that had led her to the resistance in the first place, the belief that, no matter how small or insignificant her actions might seem, they could make a difference. That belief had once been the cornerstone of her identity, the reason she had chosen to become a teacher, to devote herself to nurturing young minds. And even though the world had turned upside down, even though the war had taken so much from her, Marianne found herself clinging to that hope once more. It was in this fragile space that the unexpected happened. One evening, as Marianne walked home from the school, she saw him, a British officer standing at the edge of the alley, his uniform unmistakable. Her heart stopped for a moment, a wave of panic rushing through her. What was he doing here? What did he want? It wasn't unusual for soldiers of all nationalities to be in France, but seeing a British officer in the middle of Verdun, a town firmly under German control, was a rare sight. For a moment, Marianne thought about turning away, about pretending she hadn't seen him. But something stopped her. A strange, almost magnetic pull urged her to move forward, to confront whatever was happening, whatever he represented. The officer was tall, with sharp features and a weary expression, as if he had been through too many battles to count. His uniform was neatly pressed, but his eyes were tired, as though the weight of the war had begun to take its toll on him as well. When their eyes met, Marianne felt a flash of recognition. Though she didn't know him, there was something in his gaze that made her feel as though they had met before, as though he had seen her in a way no one else had. The officer smiled faintly, a gesture that, though small, seemed almost out of place in the grim surroundings of the town. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, charged with the knowledge that both were living in a world governed by danger and suspicion. Marianne felt her throat tighten as she wondered if she should speak first. But before she could say anything, the officer broke the silence. "You're Marianne, aren't you?" His voice was low, almost tentative, as if he were unsure whether he had the right to speak her name. "I've heard of you." Marianne froze. How could he possibly know her? She had never seen this man before, never spoken to him. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation, but the officer didn't give her a chance to ask questions. "I'm here on behalf of the resistance," he continued, his tone earnest, almost pleading. "You've been helping, haven't you?" Marianne's heart skipped a beat. The resistance. She had never told anyone about her involvement, not in the open at least. She had been careful, kept her actions small and inconspicuous, never drawing attention to herself. Yet here, in front of her, was a man who seemed to know everything. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Someone had been watching her, someone had been paying attention to the small, subtle acts of defiance she had undertaken. The fear she felt was immediate, overwhelming. Had she been discovered? Was this the moment when everything she had done would come crashing down around her? But instead of arresting her, instead of dragging her away to some dark, cold cell, the officer took a step closer and extended his hand. "I'm Major James Collier," he said, his voice still low. "I've been working with the British forces in this area. We've been watching the situation closely. You've shown bravery in ways many people here haven't. But there's more to be done. We need you." For a long moment, Marianne couldn't find her voice. She was overwhelmed, stunned by the unexpectedness of it all. She had always known there was a possibility that someone, somewhere, would eventually discover her involvement in the resistance. But she had never imagined it would be like this, that a British officer, an enemy in her mind, would come to her for help. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. She had spent so long hating the soldiers who occupied her country, and now here she was, standing in front of one of them, being offered the very thing she had fought for, a chance to make a real difference. "What do you want from me?" Marianne finally managed to ask, her voice shaky. She couldn't hide the wariness in her tone. She was still unsure whether she could trust him, whether his words were genuine or part of some larger scheme. "I need you to trust me," Major Collier replied, his gaze steady. "We know you've been passing messages, helping the resistance. But we need more. We need someone on the inside. Someone who can gather intelligence, who can help us disrupt the German operations here. We can't do it without you." Marianne felt a knot form in her stomach. The gravity of his words hit her hard. She had been a small part of something much larger, something dangerous, but now Major Collier was asking her to take on a much larger role, to risk not only her life but the lives of everyone she cared about. There was no going back once she agreed to this. I don't know," she said, her voice faltering. She wanted to help, she wanted to do something meaningful, but the stakes were higher now than ever before. The fear of being caught was one thing, but now, with the British officer standing before her, asking her to become a key player in a war she had barely begun to understand, it felt like everything had changed. Major Collier watched her, his expression unreadable. "I understand your hesitation," he said quietly. "But think about what you've already done. Think about the lives that could be saved if we're successful. Think about your students, your family, and the future of this town. We need your help." The words hung in the air between them. Marianne felt a surge of conflicting emotions, fear, doubt, guilt, but also a flicker of hope. The officer was right. The future of her town, of her country, hung in the balance. If she turned away now, if she chose to stay silent, she would be nothing more than an observer, a passive bystander in the face of a war that was taking everything from her. But if she chose to act, if she chose to take the risk, she could be part of something that might actually make a difference. It was a decision that could mean life or death. And yet, in that moment, with Major Collier standing before her, Marianne made her choice. "I'll help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but firm. The officer's eyes softened, a brief flash of gratitude passing between them. "Good," he said. "You've made the right choice." In that instant, Marianne knew her life would never be the same. She was no longer just a teacher in an occupied town. She was part of something much larger, something that held the promise of hope, but also the undeniable weight of danger. And as she walked away from the British officer that evening, a mixture of dread and resolve settled in her chest. She had made her decision. There was no turning back now. The days that followed Marianne's decision to align herself with Major Collier and the British resistance were filled with a new kind of tension, one that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had crossed a threshold, and there was no way to unmake that choice. As soon as the words had left her mouth, sealing her fate, a heavy responsibility settled over her like a cloak she could neither shake off nor remove. She had agreed to help, But the weight of that decision was more than she had anticipated. The fear that had been a constant companion for so long had now taken on a different form. It was no longer just a fear of discovery or punishment, it was a fear of the unknown, of what might lie ahead now that she had stepped fully into the darkness of resistance.